on the inside switch. My apologies to those listening at home. We're in Deuteronomy 33, and we're also going to be looking at Genesis 49. All right, so in Genesis 49, Jacob gives his final benediction to his sons, and then he dies. Deuteronomy, Moses is going to give his final benediction to Israel, and then immediately after that, in Deuteronomy 34, he's going to die. All right, so these two things, they're stacked up for us to compare. And they're also, they're structured in the same way. So as we read the blessing, you're going to see each of the tribes of Israel mentioned, and specific blessings mentioned for each tribe. So we'll get to that in just a second. But where I want us to start is with a couple of other sections here in Moses' blessing, because he does a little bit more than just list out the 12 tribes and give them their blessings. He includes what we might call an introduction and a conclusion to this blessing. All right, so starting in verse 2 through verse 5, we've got some introductory statements, and then from verse 26 through the end of the chapter, we have some concluding statements. I want us to look at these things together, and what kind of lessons we can draw from this message, the general message that Moses gives to Israel, because this is where we're going to see a lot of comparisons between this and the Song of Moses that we just read in chapter 32. So let's start in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Yes, he loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you, when Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus the Lord became king in Jeshurun, when the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together." All right, this is the introduction to the blessing, and it speaks of the Lord's love for Israel. And this is also what sets us up for a comparison between this and the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. Because Moses repeats a name for Israel that so far we've only heard once, and it's only been in Deuteronomy 32. It's what he calls them in verse 5. Right? He says, "The Lord became king in Jeshurun." It's not a very common name for Israel. It's a poetic nickname for Israel. It means the upright one. All right, and this is where we're going to start. Because we said that Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, is about Israel's betrayal. Right? So God chooses Israel out of all the nations. Israel alone gets the Lord's special attention. And he leads them through the wilderness. He's with them the whole time. And instead, they choose to follow after these other gods that are not gods. Demons that are new gods that their fathers did not fear. And the way that Moses expresses that is... let me see if I can find the verse real quick. Yeah, chapter 32, verse 15. "But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth." All right, but Moses calls him Jeshurun there in chapter 32, verse 15. And it's supposed to be ironic, right? He calls them the upright ones, but what they're doing is being anything but upright. Right? They're abandoning the Lord. They are scoffing at him. They are worshiping strange gods. They have forgotten God. Now, what we're going to see in chapter 33 is Jeshurun being used ironically in this chapter, or is it being used unironically, that is, seriously? Does the Lord, through Moses, mean upright ones? We'll consider that as we read the blessings. Excuse me. Before we jump into the blessings and answer this question about Jeshurun, I want us to notice the way that the Lord has framed his grace on Israel. All right, so we get yet another retelling of the Exodus story, starting in verse 2. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. And that's basically, so those are three different mountains, right? And that's tracing the progress of the Exodus, right? From Mount Sinai all the way to where they're at now, standing, at the plains of Moab, getting ready to cross over into Canaan. And the Lord has been with them all along the way. Now look at what he does. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Now, if you had to just take that verse just right out of context and identify who are the 10,000s of holy ones, right? Who are the holy 10,000s that the Lord is coming from when he appears on the mountains? Who would you identify those as? Who do we normally read of as the Lord's 10,000s of holy ones? Angels, typically, right? We saw that in Daniel 7. He's accompanied by 10,000s in Daniel 7. Excuse me. We see it in Revelation whenever he has myriads around him. Now, look where this goes, though. Verse 3. Yes, he loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you, when Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Now, in verse 3, who would you have to identify the holy ones as? Israel. Yeah. Notice the way that Moses has put these things in parallel at the beginning of verse 3. This is really common for Hebrew, right? We read it in the Psalms all the time. Hebrew poetry is mostly composed in couplets, right? A poetic couplet is just two lines, right? That's why we call it a couplet. And in Hebrew poetry, a lot of times you will have what we call parallelism. So the first line of the couplet will say pretty much exactly the same thing as the second line of the couplet. Excuse me. All right, we call that parallelism. It's typical of the repetitive style of Hebrew. And I'm sure y'all have noticed that reading your Old Testaments, that if it's worth saying something once in Hebrew, it's worth saying at least twice, right? Possibly more. Sometimes you will see one line, like the first line is developed in the second line. So it's, the same idea is stated again, but it's advanced, it's developed. Like, let's see, like verse 6. Go to chapter 33, verse 6. This is the first of the blessings. Let Reuben live and not die. All right, that's the first line of the couplet. But let his men be few. That's the second line of the couplet. And that second line develops the first line, right? Reuben is not going to die out. Reuben's going to live. So the tribe is going to stick around. They're going to have an inheritance in Israel. But it's not going to be a big inheritance, right? They're going to be around, but they're not going to be huge in Israel. Sometimes, like in verse 3, though, and this is, I think, more common in our Old Testament, the couplets, the two lines of the couplet basically just repeat the same thing using different terms. So we have a couplet at the beginning of verse 3. Yes, he loved his people. All right, that's the first line. all his holy ones were in his hand. Right, we see the same idea expressed again in that second line. Right? He loved his people the way that's re-expressed in the second line as he holds them in his hand. Right? That's another way of saying that the Lord loves his people. He holds them in his hand. Excuse me. Well, the first line tells us who he loved, his people. But then in the second line, Moses refers to them as his holy ones. Now, this is an interesting thing that Moses does here, because the first time that he mentions holy ones in this blessing, he's talking about his heavenly court. Right? He's talking about the angels that attend him around his throne. But then he uses that same name, Kodesh, holy ones, to describe his people in verse 3. So in other words, what God has done with Israel, besides accompanying them through the wilderness, leading them out of Egypt to the promised land, is that his love for them is so great that he has exalted them as not just a special chosen people, over and against all of the other nations, but he's put them on par with his holy ones. Right? This is, by the way, this is not a message that's just constrained here, and it's also not constrained to the Old Testament. Remember what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 6. Paul tells us something very similar about the church. Remember, the problem in 1 Corinthians 6 is brothers taking each other to court. Right? Christians taking each other to court and suing each other. All right, Paul says, you shouldn't do that. You remember what his explanation is for why you should not sue other Christians? He says, don't you know that the saints will judge the world? Don't you know that we will judge angels? Right? This is also of a piece with the sentiment of Psalm 8. Right? Whenever I consider, the stars, the works of your hands, what is man that you are mindful of him? Right? Yet, the psalmist says, you have made us a little lower than the heavenly beings, the Elim, the holy ones. Excuse me, the angels. There's this idea that part of God's love, his choosing of his people, is that he treats us as if we're on par with the angels. Now, in everything that we've read, we could talk about Israel in the Old Testament, or the church in the New Testament, or the church now. Have any of those groups done anything to merit that kind of treatment from God? Not at all. And it's entirely the opposite. This is where this stands in contrast with the Song of Moses, right? And we've seen this all through Deuteronomy, haven't we? That everything is built on this curses and blessings structure, right? And it's all built on how Israel treats God versus how God treats Israel, right? And God's treatment of Israel and God's treatment of us is always better than Israel's treatment of God, our treatment of God. Here we're getting an amazing statement, an amazing expression of God's grace. That he is giving his people something that is not merited. They do not deserve this love. Right, being in his hand and being called holy ones. Look at the rest of the description of verse 3, by the way. This continues along that line of Israel does not deserve to have this said about them. So they followed in your steps, or your translation might say that they sat or they dwelt at your feet, receiving direction from you, or receiving your words. Did Israel do that? Yes and no. They did sit at God's feet in a sense, right? They were encamped around the foot of the mountain while God was up on the mountain delivering the law to Moses. And technically they did hear the law, right? Whether it stayed there or not, that's a different question, right? But they've had the whole law presented to them. They have received direction from God. They've received God's words. And yet, at the same time, we understand pretty clearly that in the scheme of things, no, they've not followed in God's steps. Right? In the way that counts, they've not listened to God's words. Right? When Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. And by the way, on that note, what he says in verse 4, Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. How long is Israel going to keep hold of this possession? Not long. Right? Remember, Josiah rediscovers the law centuries after this. I mean, we're talking maybe 600 or 700 years after this. It's been lost for who knows how long, right? They observe the first Passover that has been observed since the time of the judges. Right? We're talking at least, like at minimum, 400 years. They've not had the law. They've not been following it at all. Excuse me. And yet, this is the blessing. Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus the Lord became king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. And again, up to this point, has Israel treated the Lord as their king? Not exactly. And yet this is the blessing that Moses is putting on Israel. Again, none of this is anything that Israel has deserved. But where Moses was focusing on Israel's unfaithfulness in chapter 32 in the song, here he is focusing on God's faithfulness. And so here the statement, the name Jeshurun is not used ironically. Right? The Lord is treating Israel as if they were the people that they ought to be, rather than treating them as the people that they are. And we'll see that as we continue in the blessing section. Excuse me, but I want to actually jump ahead and catch the conclusion of the blessing first, before we get into the specific blessings for the tribes. Go to verse 26. Because what is said here in the conclusion is just going to amplify what Moses has said in the introduction. Verse 26, there is none like God, O Jeshurun. So there he repeats the nickname. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He thrust out the enemy before you and said, destroy. So Israel lived in safety. Jacob lived alone in a land of grain and wine, whose heavens drop down dew. All right, again, just expressing God's complete faithfulness over Israel. How happy are you, O Israel? All right, this is, by the way, that's the same sort of language you hear in the Beatitudes. Right? Happy are you translates the word blessed, or most blessed. Blessed are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph? Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their backs. I want to pay special attention to this question that Moses asks at the end. Who is like you? Now, we've heard that question asked before. We hear it asked in the Psalms. We hear it asked in the prophets. And most of the time, like 99% of the time in the Bible, whenever someone is asking, who is like you, who's it addressed to? To God. Yeah, in fact, that's what we saw in the song by the sea in Exodus 15. Right after they've crossed the Red Sea. That's one of the questions that's asked in the song. Who is like you, O God? Right? Excuse me. Or, O Lord, they use the holy name there. Who is like you among the Elim, among the heavenly beings? This is one of the only places, this is exceedingly rare, where we find this question asked of someone who is not God. Who is like you? But it's addressed to Israel. And again, this is a statement of how how gracious God is being in his choosing of Israel, how much God has elevated, exalted Israel in his choosing of them. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph? All right, so in all things, when we look at passages like this, right, when Moses uses this kind of language to describe Israel, language that's typically used to talk to God, or at the beginning, where he uses language that is typically reserved for talking about angels, heavenly beings. The message that we get from this blessing is we don't think highly enough about God's grace. Like, we're not astounded enough by God's grace. We don't recognize how good we've got it, how much unmerited favor God gives us in the way that he treats us. Excuse me. But it's proclaimed here in Deuteronomy 33. All right, so I think we're ready to get to the blessings themselves. Any questions or comments about the way that this is all framed up, the intro and the conclusion? Wayne? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Well, so that's where we have to be careful, because we can certainly possess that kind of cynicism about Israel, because the text is, I won't say the text is, invited us not to have that kind of cynicism, right? The text shows us all of these horrible things that Israel has done, all of these ways that Israel has disobeyed the Lord, and yet, do we find that kind of cynical or backbiting attitude coming out of the Lord himself in the way that he treats Israel? Right? That's kind of the amazing thing about the grace that is expressed in this blessing, is that there's nothing about this blessing that's tongue-in-cheek. Right? Now, there's plenty in the Scriptures that God says about his people that's tongue-in-cheek. Right? Again, like we just saw it in chapter 32, whenever Moses refers to Israel as Jeshurun. That's obviously tongue-in-cheek. They're not the upright ones in that song. But as we read through this blessing, there's absolutely nothing in this set of verses that makes us think that God's being anything but completely serious in referring to Israel as Jeshurun, the upright one. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that's the thing. That's the amazing thing about God's grace, is that if you were to just rip Deuteronomy 33 out of context, right? If you were somebody that didn't know anything about Israel, didn't know anything about the history of God's people, and you just had Deuteronomy 33 set in front of you, so this is about God's people. What kind of people do you think they are? You'd read this chapter and you'd think this is one of the finest, most upstanding groups of people that's ever lived. Right? Because there's nothing ironic in this song. There's nothing negative in this song about what Israel has done. It's all good. And again, that's the amazing thing, is that this is the blessing that Moses is leaving us with. Go ahead, Wayne. Yeah, their faithlessness. Mm-hmm. Yes. everything that we've seen in Deuteronomy has been framed as that kind of duality. You've got, blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience. The thing is, and as we read this earlier, we know that Israel's going to be disobedient, but if they repent, God is going to treat them as if they have always been obedient. Right? I forget what chapter it was in, but Moses tells Israel that if they repent after falling away from the Lord, that the Lord is going to bless them and multiply them even more than he had beforehand. Right? He's going to be treating them better than before their disobedience. Right? Again, now it's not inviting us to say, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Right? That's not the message. The message is that the Lord is extremely gracious, and that if Israel is willing to repent, he is willing to treat them as if they have always been obedient. And again, I think that's kind of the vibe that we get out of this blessing, is they are being treated as if they are righteous and good people, even though we and they know that they're not. Excuse me, if that makes sense. So, good questions. All right, let's turn our attention to verse 6. Now, I want us to, as we read through, well, I'll tell you what, we'll just read through. We'll, by the end of this set of blessings, we'll reveal something that might be surprising about this. We'll see if you pick up on it as we read. Verse 6, "Let Reuben live and not die, but let his men be few. And this he said of Judah, Hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him into his people. With your hands contend for him, and be a help against his adversaries. Of Levi, he said, Gather to Levi your Thummim, and your Urim to your godly one, whom you tested at Massa, with whom you quarreled at the waters of Meribah. Who said of his father and mother, I regard them not, who disowned his brothers and ignored his children, for they observed your word and kept your covenant. They shall teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. They shall put incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. Bless, O Lord, his substance, and accept the work of his hands. Crush the loins of his adversaries, of those who hate him, that they rise not again. Of Benjamin, he said, The beloved of the Lord dwells in safety. The high God surrounds him all day long, and dwells between his shoulders. Of Joseph, he said, Blessed be the Lord by his land, with the choicest gifts of heaven above and of the deep that crouches beneath, with the choicest fruits of the sun and the rich yield of the months, with the finest produce of the ancient mountains and the abundance of the everlasting hills, with the best gifts of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwells in the bush. May these rest on the head of Joseph, on the pate of him who is prince among his brothers. A firstborn bull, he has majesty, and his horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he shall gore the peoples, all of them to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. And of Zebulun he said, Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call peoples to their mountain. There they offer right sacrifices, for they draw from the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand. And of Gad he said, Blessed be he who enlarges Gad. Gad crouches like a lion. He tears off arm and scalp. He chose the best of the land for himself, and there a commander's portion was reserved. And he came with the heads of the people. With Israel he executed the justice of the Lord and his judgments for Israel. And of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's cub that leaps from Bashan. Of Naphtali, he said, O Naphtali, sated with favor and full of the blessing of the Lord, possess the lake in the south. And of Asher, he said, Most blessed of sons be Asher. Let him be the favorite of his brothers, and let him dip his foot in oil. Your bars shall be iron and bronze, and as your days, so shall your strength be. All right, and those are the blessings. That takes us into the conclusion that we just went over. All right. Well, let me just ask you, did anything out of all that stand out to you? Was there anything that you, as we were reading through, you thought, oh, that's interesting, or that's different, or that's neat? Okay, what about Reuben's blessing? Yes. Yeah, it's funny how that's not brought up here. In fact, that's worth going back to Genesis 49. Right, that's how Jacob starts out, right? As blessings go, well, really in both cases, this is not the way you'd necessarily want to start out with the blessings. Right, Genesis 49, verse 3, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Right, it sounds like it's starting good. Unstable as water, you shall have no preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. You went up to my couch. All right, now that much is not mentioned in the blessing of Reuben, but what Jacob said to Reuben comes about in this blessing that Moses gives Reuben. Right? You shall not have preeminence, Jacob tells Reuben. And what does Moses tell Reuben? Let Reuben live and not die, but let his men be few. Right? They're going to be a minor tribe in Israel, even though they are the tribe of the firstborn. Wayne? Ah, there we go. I was wondering if anyone would notice that. There's only 11 tribes mentioned in this set of blessings. Simeon is not mentioned. Now let's talk about Simeon for a minute. Simeon is an interesting case. While we're in Genesis 49, let's consider Simeon, because Simeon is the one mentioned next after Reuben in the blessings of Genesis 49. Verse 5, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. All right. And at this point, in Genesis 49, we're basically 0 for 3, right? It's like, Jacob, if you're wanting to bless your sons before you die, we are not off to a great start here. Reuben will not have preeminence. The next two oldest sons, Simeon and Levi, also, it's not stated outright, but they're not going to have preeminence because he basically spends the whole time cursing them. Now, why does he curse them? In verse 6 and verse 7. What's the reason given for his cursing? Yes. Okay, yeah, I'm hearing the answer from several people. It has to do with their violence specifically against the men of Shechem in Genesis 34. Remember, one of the princes of Shechem seduces Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and so Simeon and Levi concoct this scheme because this prince wants to marry Dinah, and Simeon and Levi essentially say, oh yeah, well, we've got an idea. You go ahead and marry, but you have to get circumcised first. Right, so the whole city gets circumcised, and they're sitting around sore, and Simeon and Levi go in and murder all of them. Right, it's one of the great stories of the Old Testament. And at the end of the chapter, at the end of Genesis 34, Jacob rags them out for what they've done. Right, you've caused me to be a stench in the nostrils of those living around me, he says. And so he brings that back up here. Just like he brought up Reuben's sin, lying with his wife, he brings up Simeon and Levi's sin here. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. All right, now, what's the consequence of the curse? Like, what's the content of the curse? What does Jacob say is going to happen to them? Yeah, they're going to be divided and scattered. Now, this is where things take an interesting turn. Let's consider with Levi. is Levi divided and scattered through Israel? They are. Right? Where's Levi's territory in Israel? What is Levi's inheritance? They don't have an inheritance. They are scattered throughout the entire nation of Israel. Now, what about Simeon? Well, they kind of sort of get an inheritance, but they likewise end up being scattered. And this is what's fascinating to me, is that you have both Simeon and Levi falling under the same curse from Jacob, but it plays out in two very, very different ways. We don't know why it plays out for Simeon necessarily the way it plays out, but for Levi, well, the blessings in Deuteronomy 33 give us some sense as to why Levi is getting what he gets. But first, let's turn our attention to Simeon. Go to Joshua chapter 19. Hope I'm remembering this right. Yeah, Joshua 19, verse 1. All right, this is as the inheritance is being divvied up. The second lot came out for Simeon, for the tribe of the people of Simeon, according to their clans, and their inheritance was in the midst of the inheritance of the people of Judah. All right, so if you ever look at a map of the 12 tribes of Israel, most of our map makers will try to carve out some territory inside of Judah for Simeon. But it's not if you look at one of those maps, it's not laid out that neatly in Joshua or in Judges. It's more, they're completely scattered out in Judah. They end up kind of all over the place. And in fact, later on we read, I want to say it's in 1 Chronicles 4. Where do we read of this? Yeah, 1 Chronicles 4. We get a genealogy of Simeon, starting in verse 24. And we're not going to read all the genealogy. We're going to skip down to verse 42, just to pick up this interesting little detail. Some of them, so some of the men of Simeon, 500 men out of the Simeonites went to Mount Seir, having as their leaders Pelatiah, Neariah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi. All right. Where is Mount Seir? Is that even in Israel? It's not. It's not in Israel. All right, Simeon is so scattered out. I mean, they are all over the place. We noted also, as we were considering the genealogies in the book of Numbers, that Simeon, by the end of Numbers, Simeon becomes the smallest tribe. Right? They lose a ton of people over the course of the wilderness wandering. They're minuscule. And they're not really given much of an inheritance. They are given several cities within the inheritance of Judah. But they're not given their own proper inheritance, and then they scatter out from that. And then really the last that we read of them doing anything is in Judges, like at the beginning. And then they just kind of disappear, right? We read of them a few times in Chronicles. Like they're apparently still around in a strong enough presence that, let's see, there are still some cities attributed to their tribe during the time of Josiah. But as a people, they are entirely inconsequential in the rest of the Old Testament, except for helping Judah with conquering his inheritance right at the beginning of Judges. And that's it. Just poof, gone. Levi is a different story. They're scattered out, but for completely different reasons, which we will have to get to on Sunday. So we'll pick up in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 8 on Sunday, and consider why Levi gets scattered out and divided in a much different way than Simeon does. Thank you so much for your kind attention and questions and comments this evening.